Well, we've been going through the Acts of the Apostles for some time, haven't we? Got to the 25th chapter. And a lot of it has been about the Apostle Paul and how badly treated he was. And last time we looked at the trial that he had to go to, where Felix, the Roman governor, was in charge. And he was very much against the apostle. But Paul said that he believed in the law and the prophets like his forefathers had done. He believed in the resurrection of the just and of the unjust. And having heard both sides, Felix decided to defer his judgment until the chief captain came down from Jerusalem. In the meantime, Paul was kept in custody. However, he was given quite a bit of freedom and was able to meet with his friends. Felix was married to Drusilla, who'd been married to another man before, and she was the daughter of King Herod Agrippa, and she was curious to see Paul. When a meeting was arranged, Paul reasoned with them of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. And this judgment to come made Felix tremble. He thought he was the judge, but there was another judge to come. Felix then sent the apostle away, saying that he would think about Christ and speak to him again when it was more convenient. But he was also trying to get money from Paul as a bribe to let him go. But the day came when Felix himself was taken away from Rome to stand trial for his crimes, and so his place was taken by another governor called Porcius Festus. The question was, what would happen to Paul now? Would the new governor let him go, as he should have done? Or would he have to stay even longer than the time he'd been? It had already been 2 years. Or would he be handed over to the Jews? That would be even worse. The Jews certainly wanted that, and lost no time in applying to Festus for this. He'd only been in office for 3 days when he went from Caesarea to Jerusalem to meet the high priest and the Jewish leaders. He wanted to get acquainted with the people of the province, it says in that first verse. That province meaning the province of the Roman Empire, just a small part of the Roman Empire. Whereas Paul made no application for his release, the Jews made application for his death. You see, malice is such an evil thing that it can't wait to get fulfilled. Over 2 years had gone by, and you'd have thought these people might have calmed down, but no, they still hadn't softened up at all. They were still just as hateful against Paul. In fact, verse 2 suggests that Paul was uppermost in their mind. There must have been many other issues that they needed to talk to the new governor about. But no, Paul's death was their main desire. Sometimes when a person's got it in for somebody, all other issues get pushed to one side. They're so determined about this thing. These Jews couldn't wait for a fresh trial. They thought that they would ingratiate themselves with a new judge and get him on their side right at the beginning. It's rather like when a new manager takes over an office. Get some people try to get in his good books and run their colleagues down. Verse 3 says that they desired favour against Paul. They were trying to get Festus to show favouritism. But those who have favourites are necessarily going to be against others. Favouritism against Paul. Most favouritism is for somebody, isn't it? This was favouritism against somebody. And this is made clear in this verse when it says, it was against Paul. Christians need to be very careful about having favourites, for this may lead to them being against other people. A school teacher may have a favourite, but that might mean the other children get left out of it. The Jews also purposed that they would try and get Paul by using an old trick. They previously used it but failed. No matter how much they got round Festus, They couldn't be sure that he would give Paul over to them, so they decided to keep this other card up their sleeve. If they could get Festus merely to send Paul back to Jerusalem for trial, then they would sit in wait for him and assassinate him. Such was the evil of these men and the intense hatred they had against the Christian faith. And notice how unjust the Jews had become. They wanted Festus to send for Paul right away before he himself returned to Caesarea. So there was Caesarea and there was Jerusalem, and the governor had gone from Caesarea to Jerusalem. He'd waited there, but they wanted Paul now to make the same journey so they could get him when he came. How people who were so religious as they were could be such liars is hard to understand. They must have believed that the end justifies the means. And this was an idea later borrowed by the Catholic Church when it persecuted Christians and spread lies about them. And Islam today is the same. They're inveterate lies. I sometimes think their God that they believe in and they feel strongly about their God, is he a God that thinks it's wrong to tell lies? Because they tell such blatant lies. And their lies are trying to justify themselves. The Jews, having failed to ambush Paul, still reckon on trying it again. And this shows that the devil will often use the same trick or the same temptation as is used before. He doesn't give up just because his victim didn't give in the first time. The devil may not have overcome a Christian before, but he will try again. That's for sure. Just because they were able to withstand him before, it doesn't mean to say that they will withstand him the next time. But Festus wasn't having any of this. And in verse 4 he tells them that Paul will be kept at Caesarea and that he himself would be returning there shortly to sort things out. You might have thought that the new governor would have tried to please these people so as to start off his period in office with friendliness. But it wasn't to be. He wasn't going to be taken in by these people. Perhaps Felix, the previous governor, had spoken to him about these evil Jews and how bad they were and how crooked they were, and he wasn't going to give in to them. So once again, God overruled in the plans of men to prevent those who sought the apostles' death from doing so. Paul had known about the previous attempts to ambush him. Do you remember his young nephew overheard what was going to happen and he came to the castle and he told the chief captain about it? Paul knew about that first attack, but he didn't know anything about the second one. But still, God was going to keep him safe. It's exactly the same for us. We can see some of the dangers which we've been delivered from, and we're very thankful to God for it, aren't we? But there are many more which we haven't seen. All sorts of things could have happened to us and was going to happen to us, but God stepped in and we didn't know anything about it. Festus tells the Jewish leaders in verse 5 that if they felt so bad about Paul, they should send some able men down to Caesarea and accuse the apostle there at a proper trial. It was as if he was saying, I'm not going to be party to anything underhanded. Notice also that he uses the word if there be any wickedness in him. You say that he's wicked, maybe you're right, maybe he is, but I must find that out for myself. And it's a pity that not more people are like this when it comes to acting upon what men and women say about others. When we hear a person being criticised, we should not take it for certain what is being said is true. We should try and find out the facts for ourselves. When two people or two groups of people are at loggerheads, it's not necessarily the people who inform you about it first who are in the right. But anyway, Festus stayed at Jerusalem for another 10 days, and then he returned to Caesarea with these other people in verse 6. He was determined to sort the whole thing out quickly. And so within 2 weeks of being governor, Festus brings Paul to yet another trial. It must have been a constant challenge to Paul's courage to be brought from one trial to another like this. All the time it seemed to be happening to him. And yet he could always hold on to that one fact that the Lord had promised him that he would one day testify of him at Rome, and therefore nothing too bad could happen to him before that. This trial took the same line as the previous one. It was only the judge who was different. It began with the prosecution in verse 7, and it says that his adversary stood round about him, trying to frighten him. He was outnumbered like a deer that is surrounded by a pack of hounds. They laid many complaints against him, and they thought up many crimes which they could accuse him of. They said he'd done grievous things, really bad things, things which had caused much grief to many people. All lies. We're told who they couldn't prove any of the things which they said. They lacked the evidence. I wonder over the years how many grievous complaints have been wrongly made against Christians. The prosecution was then followed by the defence in verse 8, Paul being allowed to speak for himself, and therefore he insists on his innocence. He had not transgressed the law of the Jews. He believed in the law and the prophets. He'd already said that. In fact, Christ, who he preached, was the fulfilment of Jewish law. It was these Jewish leaders who had offended Jewish law. Paul had not profaned the temple either. He loved God's house. He showed great respect for it. Nor had he done anything against Caesar, he says. So it seems as though his accusers must have said that he'd done wrong against the Romans, as if they were concerned for Caesar, when in reality they were more against Caesar than anybody. They were Caesar's enemies. They hated the fact that the Romans had taken over their land and they wanted to get rid of them. It's all lies. But Paul was concerned for all men, the Romans as much as anybody, and he wanted their salvation. These Jews didn't believe that Romans could be saved. They believed that they were Gentiles and away from God, and God was very much against them. It reminds us when former Jewish leaders said to the previous Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, that if he didn't put Christ to death, he was not Caesar's friend. Especially as verse 9 goes on to say that Festus was willing to show the Jews a pleasure, which is said about Pilate. Just like Pilate decided against Christ because he didn't want to become unpopular, so Festus would do the same thing with Paul for the same reason. The love of popularity, like the love of money, has led lots of people to do very foolish things, to hurt themselves and do many wrongs. Festus knew that Paul was innocent, but he dared not set him free because he knew that the Jews would hate him for it. However, Festus asked Paul the question, was he willing to go back to Jerusalem so as to be tried there? He didn't order Paul to do so, he only suggested it because he was a Roman citizen. He knew he couldn't push him around too much, and we've got to respect Festus for that. Little did he know that his suggestion would have led to Paul's assassination had Paul agreed to it, because these people were lying in wait for him. The apostle, of course, would have nothing to do with it, for the Lord gave him wisdom which was necessary in order to keep himself safe in such a crisis. In times of trouble, the Lord not only gives his people patience so as to bear with their trials, but he also gives them wisdom so they can make the right decisions as to what they should do. I'm sure we've all done that at times. We've asked God to give us wisdom to know what we should do. Our Lord has told us all to be as wise as serpents, as well as being as harmless as doves. Paul knew that going back to Jerusalem could well mean exposing himself to danger, so he says that he won't go back there. He stood at Caesar's judgment seat to be judged as a Roman by the Romans, and that was right. He said he'd done no wrong to the Jews. And Paul saying this shows that all Christians are to submit themselves to the laws of their land. They are not exempt from the jurisdiction of the civil powers. And we hope that we shall never be found in the dock in a court of law, but if we ever are, then we have to respect those who try us. But Paul adds the words at the end of verse 10, "To the Jews I have done no wrong, as thou very well knowest." To the Jews I have done no wrong, as thou very well knowest, which was a sharp reminder that whereas the apostle was innocent, Festus himself was guilty in not letting Paul go free. He knew very well that Paul had done nothing wrong against the Jews, yet he was suggesting that he go to Jerusalem and be tried there by the Jews. But then many people suggest things, knowing very well that what they suggest is wrong. In verse 11, Paul states that he was prepared to die if he was truly guilty of any crime. If he had committed anything worthy of death, he refused not to die. An amazing thing to say that. In this verse, Paul sets down the principle which Christians must adhere to in a court of law, that if they are guilty, they should be prepared to accept the punishment of their crimes, but if they're innocent, they should do all they can to be acquitted. Paul realised that if Festus delivered him over to a trial in Jerusalem, this might mean certain death for him, and a definite injustice on behalf of Festus. And this made him, he made this clear to him. But Paul, seeing the constant threat of being handed over to the Jews and going on all the time, he decides to make a definite appeal to the Roman court. He says, "I appeal unto Caesar. I want my case brought before the Roman emperor." Now at this time, the Roman emperor was Nero, one of history's most wicked men. But as Paul saw it, he would rather face Nero than face the Jews. He could expect more justice from the infamous Nero than from the high priest. What a sad tribute this was to the state of the Jewish nation. And it was the same in David's day. Do you remember when he felt so much hatred coming from Saul, the king of Israel, he decided he'd be better off falling into the hands of the Philistines. And then it would be out of Saul's hands. Every Roman citizen was entitled to appeal to Caesar's judgment on big issues, and this obliged the magistrate to send the prisoner to Rome. And maybe Paul also remembered the words of Christ to him in the castle that night, that he would bear testimony to him in Rome one day. And he thought, well, this is the way to do it. In verse 12, Festus says, "As thou hast appealed unto Caesar, to Caesar thou shalt go." He's glad to get rid of Paul. He's glad to get rid of this problem. He was washing his hands of it, rather like Pilate did. And so Paul would stay in custody for another period, for by appealing to Caesar, it meant that he couldn't be set free until he was cleared by Caesar in Rome. He would need to have great patience, for when we've got some big problem hanging over us, we do so want to get it sorted out one way or the other. We hate having the thing dragging on all the time. But for Paul, there'd be no quick solution. And this is the way God wanted it to be. And God sometimes allows things to happen to us like that. He deliberately keeps us waiting so as to test us. As Paul said himself in that passage we read in Romans, we glory in tribulations. Now that tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope. And hope maketh not ashamed. What an amazing thing for Paul to say, that tribulation is a good thing, that Christians should glory in. So when he wrote those words in Romans, he wasn't just saying, this would be good for Christians, I'd like it. He's talking about his own situation. Look at what he went through. Look at all the tribulation he went through. He suffered one setback after another, But it was saying here that that was useful. And yet tribulation is the last thing that people want. They look at it as a curse, not a blessing. But the Bible is right, and history proves it, that the more God has blessed people in an earthly sense, so the less they love him and seek him. The Old Testament is full of this truth, particularly in the book of Judges. For when God gave Israel blessing and good times, they fell away from him into idolatry. Yet when he sold them into the hands of their enemies and they were badly treated, they sought the Lord again. We've often quoted that verse from the Psalms, haven't we? Before I was afflicted, I went astray. Affliction can keep people going on the narrow way. In the New Testament, we are shown that the best churches with the godliest Christians were those where the people didn't have much in the way of earthly blessings, whereas those churches where people prospered materially were half-hearted and lukewarm. That's what our Lord said about the church in Laodicea. Thou art lukewarm and neither cold nor hot. I will therefore spew thee out of my mouth, because thou sayest, I am rich and increase with goods and have need of nothing. Isn't this what we see today? The more that God has blessed his people with the good things of life, the less tribulation they have, so the more half-hearted they become for the cause of Christ. Paul was in constant tribulation, and he gloried in it, and that's what made him such a useful man. I would imagine in the light of this, that the only way Christ's church will ever see revival again in this land is if it's brought under tribulation. Have we not seen throughout our studies in the Acts that those two things have always gone together, persecution and the success of the gospel? And Paul realised in his day that setbacks often work out for the furtherance of the gospel. And he was proved right in his own case, for it was during his stay in prison that he wrote his epistles, Where would we be without them? Paul was a man who had learned to be content in whatever state he was in, and he's able to rejoice at all times. We saw in Philippians last night, rejoice, and I say unto you again, rejoice. Very hard, but that's Paul writing, and again he's talking about himself. So he's able to take this further imprisonment for some time to come. The happiest Christians are always those who are able to bend with God's will and don't try to quarrel with it. How mysterious life can be at times. It's like a maze, as we're about to sing in our last hymn. And Paul says later, I would have you to know that the things that have happened to me have fallen out to the furtherance of the gospel. Maybe that's true in our day. Amen.
Amen.